Hello again, and welcome to yet another module here in our course. What we're going to be doing in this module is the second of two modules on natural law. So last time we spelled out some of the kind of big overarching ideas behind natural law and how it's connected to the Catholic worldview and theological anthropology that we looked at earlier. And in this module, we're going to get a little more specific and start to talk about how natural law could actually be used to make moral choices. So we're going to show how some of those big principles we talked about last time can be applied to actual concrete situations and actions in life. Now to get there, we have to talk first a little bit about some of the basic goods and principles that make up natural law decision making. A little more specific than this whole overarching idea of aiming for human flourishing or being in communion with God in eternity. What is it that makes up, in particular, this idea of human flourishing, of a fully lived, fully realized kind of ideal human life? What does that look like? And there have been a number of different proposals put forward for talking about how we should think about this flourishing life. Perhaps one of the earliest and most important comes from the philosopher Aristotle, who talked about eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness, but really is more of this idea of flourishing or of a well-lived life. And he went through and talked about a bunch of the different goods that would make up that kind of life, which we've talked about before, right? The good of a good family life, of a successful career, of education, of some leisure time where you enjoy hobbies or sports or what have you. So there are all these different things that Aristotle would propose as making up a good life. And there have been many other thinkers who put together their lists. What I put here on the page for you is a list taken from some contemporary natural law thinkers who have come up with a list of basic goods that I think is a fairly good one. Okay, a little bit of a pun there, sorry about that. But, it's not really crucial for our purposes exactly what makes up the list. But the idea is that when we think about a good, ideal kind of human life, it's going to contain certain things that we all desire, that we all want to have as part of our life, like inner peace, like peace of conscience, like peace with others, peace with God, bodily health, knowledge of truth, and play. Right? So those are all things that would make up an ideal, flourishing life. And if we were missing any of those things, I think we would mostly all agree that if you were missing those things, something would be missing from the fulfillment you have in life as well. The other important thing about this list is that we don't really pursue any of these for something else, right? They're all goods in themselves. They're things that we just want, right? And, I'm sure we've all gone through the game or had a toddler ask us questions where, well, why do you want that? Well, because of this. Well, why do you want that? Well, because of this other thing, right? There's this gift that children have to keep asking, well, why do you want that? Why do you want that? Right? And what makes up this list of basic goods here are things that we would simply say, well, we just want it, right? We just want to know the truth. We just want to be at peace with others, to have good relationships with them. So those are going to be the things we're going to aim at to make up this flourishing life, or eudaimonia, that we've talked about in the previous module or two. Okay, so we're going to aim for this life that has these things in it, or has these things at the end. How do we accomplish that? How do we do that? Well, we talked last time about making good moral choices, good moral acts, and then developing the virtues. So that's one way to talk about it. But how do we make that good moral choice, that good moral act? How do we know that it is a good one? Well, that's where we get to these principles and rules and norms that we're going to be talking about here in this module. And the most basic principle of natural law is that we should pursue the good and avoid evil, right? So we should never intentionally do something that we know is wrong, even if the consequences might be attractive, right? right? We talked about this before in contrast to utilitarianism, where we might sometimes be instructed to do something that we think, that we feel is wrong, but the consequences are going to be good, so we're going to do it anyway. Natural law would say exactly the opposite. Okay, well, that's pretty general. Can we get a little more specific? Well, yes. Right, given this belief in the intrinsic value of human persons who are made in the image of God, we can say that we need to always treat human persons, as who's and not what's. We always need to treat people recognizing this value that they have. So one way of putting that is very famously, of course, the Golden Rule, which comes from the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, the natural law scholars would phrase this a little more academically, I suppose. And I won't give you the full academic version here because it's kind of long and convoluted. It takes a while to work through. But one way they would put it, a little more succinctly, a little more specifically perhaps than Jesus, is that we should always will the flourishing or the integral good of other persons. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means we should always want to and work for and choose for other people to have those goods that we just talked about in their life. Right? So if I'm in a situation making a choice that's going to affect other people, when I'm making my choice, I should be guided by a desire to have the people who are going to be affected reach that goal of a flourishing life, reach that goal of a life that has these goods in it. So if the action I'm going to take is going to harm someone else's bodily health or harm their peace with others or any of these other goods, well, then I ought not to do that, right? I should never intentionally harm the good of other people. And so that gives us a little more specific guidance in how we should make our choices, right? And of course, we should also will, I suppose I should say, those basic goods for ourselves as well, right? So I shouldn't make a choice that I know is going to damage the peace of my conscience, right? Or that's going to hurt my peace with others. Even though I can sometimes be tempted to make choices that I know are going to damage those basic goods, but there's some other thing that I really want right now. So obviously, according to natural law, we shouldn't do that. We should only act in a way that's going to preserve and maintain and further those basic goods. Okay, and getting a little more specific still, or a more academic way of saying, I suppose, what I just said a moment ago, is we should never intentionally act against someone's good due to any passion we have or pursuing some other good, right? So, for example, the good that you can get from the pleasure of going out and partying is a good thing, right? That there's something to be said for play, which is kind of a broad way for talking about having a good time in activities that aren't really being done for some other purpose. We just enjoy doing, whether it's dancing or playing soccer or whatever it might be. And the pleasure from a good meal, a good drink, those can all be part of that as well. But I shouldn't pursue those goods if I know that they are going to undermine other goods, like my health, like my conscience, like my relationships with other people. So I shouldn't pursue that one good of pleasure, of play, and in doing so, intentionally harm these other basic goods. I also shouldn't be driven by any sort of emotion or passion to work against these goods, right? So, for example, there might be obviously certain bodily passions that might drive us to do things that are bad for our health, for our conscience, for our relationship with others. And again, we shouldn't do those things. Or you could even have, it doesn't need to be a passion like a burning desire for something. It could also be something like sloth, right, or laziness. That's a certain kind of passion or bodily emotion or desire. And I shouldn't allow sloth to undermine any basic goods either. So hopefully you have the general idea here, even if it would take some time to work out the details, right? That what we need to do is come up with an understanding of the goods that are going to make up a good life. And then we need to act in a way that's really going to help us attain those goods, both for ourselves and for other people. And we need to avoid making choices based on lesser goods or based on emotions or passions that are going to undermine our true good or undermine the true good of other people. Okay, so that hopefully gets us a little more specific on what natural law is going to have us do. To take another step in that direction, we'll turn to the next page. All right, so on the last page, I think we maybe took at least a little step towards getting some specific guidance for how we're supposed to live. But it's still fairly abstract, right? We're probably not going to want to find ourselves in situations out there in real everyday life where we need to make a decision. We have to sit back and think about, well, what are the basic goods that make up a flourishing life? Okay, am I acting against those in this situation? Because that's really not going to be very practical in a lot of situations. So we need something a little more concrete, a little more specific that we can just say, should I do this? Nope, I know that I shouldn't do that because I know this rule or this principle, right? And in natural law theory, these are often referred to as moral norms, right? So we have kind of these big general first principles. We need to get down here to specific acts. So how do we get from the big principles down to the acts? Well, kind of the thing that bridges there in the middle is this body of moral norms, right? Which is kind of a fancy way of talking about guidelines or rules or laws for our behavior. Okay, so what are these moral norms going to be? Well, they're going to kind of vary in terms of how specific they are, but they're going to be like a lot of the moral principles or rules that you've probably learned before. Don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't lie, don't do all of these other things, right? And part of the idea of natural law is that right and wrong is built into the nature of things in the world. It's built into human nature. So one of the consequences of that belief is that even if people don't call themselves natural law theorists, or even if they wouldn't say that they're following natural law, if it really is built into the nature of the human person and of the universe, we should expect to see the natural law emerging really in almost every different group of people throughout history, right? And so what we should be able to do is to look at all these different groups, all these different ages in history, and look at what are their moral guidelines, what are their principles. And more often than not, those principles are going to reflect this natural law that's built into us and built into the world. And so when we're trying to figure out, well, what really is the natural law? How is it that we should live? What we can do is, well, one approach is to take these kind of philosophical ideas of what a good life is and then try to work out kind of philosophically, okay, then what would lead us to those goals? But another way to do it, which is at least as important, if not more so, is just looking at human nature, right? Looking at how human beings have lived in lots of different cultures throughout lots of history, and seeing what did they understand to be the right way to live, and what actually seems to work and what doesn't, right? So now obviously there's going to be variations here and there, right? There are going to be certain groups at certain times where they've come to practice something that's actually wrong or immoral, right? Obvious examples being like anti-Semitism and the Holocaust with the Nazis, or slavery in the early American South. There's all kinds of examples like this. So we're not just going to say whatever anybody has taught is okay at any time. That's part of natural law. What we need to do is look at human nature kind of comprehensively, which will help us eliminate some of those variations, if you will, and get at what's really the right way to live. What's the truly natural way to live? So we can use things like history. We can use things like sociology or psychology. We can even use things like biology, right? So what's the right way to eat, for example, right? And even if we weren't going to look at kind of cultural or moral prohibitions on gluttony or drunkenness, we could approach the issue looking at our biological nature and say, look, kind of consistently overeating or consistently drinking too much is actually bad for your health. And if we remember, bodily health is one of those basic goods. Therefore, it's a principle of natural law that you ought not to excessively use alcohol or eat in excess either, right? Which also we find as a principle in pretty much all religious, cultural traditions. There are prohibitions against drunkenness or against gluttony. And so one of the things you'll find when you're trying to figure out, well, what does natural law say to do? In many cases, what natural law is going to say to do is going to be the same principles and rules that we were all taught growing up, which, again, makes sense if we really accept this idea of natural law being built into human nature and built into the nature of the world as a whole. Now, having said all of that, there are still going to be some difficult cases, some difficult, complex situations where finding the right answer is not going to be as simple as recalling something we learned in kindergarten or Sunday school a long time ago. In those cases, what should we do? Well, that's where we have to fall back on this whole theory part of natural law theory. So if we have a complicated issue like embryonic stem cell research or homosexual marriage or something like this, that's when we have to step back and kind of go through a detailed process of really working through, okay, well, what really are the basic goods that are part of a good, flourishing human life? Okay, how does this particular action, how does this particular choice work for or against those? And this is also where sometimes the moral norms that we use on a day-to-day basis need to be really kind of analyzed more closely and made more specific, right? So, for example, we can talk about thou shalt not steal. It's a good everyday kind of moral norm. But there might be situations where we would need to take something from somebody and it might not really be stealing. Or, well, what does that mean about charging excessive interest rates on credit cards? And there again, we need to get a little more specific and work through these principles carefully. So to talk a little bit more about some of these difficult cases, we're going to turn to a couple examples here on the next page. All right, for those of you who had an ethics class before, you probably know that the one thing everyone really loves to do in ethics classes is consider some crazy scenario and figure out what's the moral or immoral thing to do in this situation. And to be a valid ethics class, we have to make sure that we do that here as well. But a little bit of joking aside, one of the reasons that this always comes up in ethics classes is when you think about many of the decisions we face in everyday life, pretty much all of the different ethical systems are going to give us the same answer, right? So, should I push an old lady down in the middle of the street just for kicks? It doesn't matter if you're a natural law theorist or if you're a utilitarian or divine command theorist or whatever it might be. They're pretty much all going to say, no, you shouldn't push down old ladies in the middle of the street just for kicks. So one of the reasons that it's important to look at difficult cases when we're thinking about ethics is that this is really where we can see the differences between the systems and really see how it is that the different ethical systems work, right? And, while most of us aren't going to face really complex ethical choices on a daily basis, they do come up in life, right? And so it's important to have thought about what our ethical principles really are before we get in those difficult situations in a hospital or at the marriage altar or wherever it might be. We need to have thought through what our principles are before we are faced with these tough choices. And so to give you an example of how natural law works in some of these tough cases, there's a couple examples I often bring up. As I said, we can often look at different religious or cultural moral guidelines as a reflection of natural law, right? So the most obvious example, I think, for most of us here in 21st century America is still the Ten Commandments, right? So that would be an example of a religious kind of cultural list of moral principles that more or less reflects the natural law. Right now, principles like thou shalt not steal, or thou shalt not bear false witness, or more commonly, thou shalt not lie, those are good standard moral norms, right? In the vast majority of situations, should I steal? Nope, that's going to help us in this situation. Should I lie? Nope. Okay, there we go. And this is why we have the moral norms, right? To give us quick, easy answers to everyday situations. But what about when more complex cases come up, right? So, for example, thou shalt not steal. Well, let's think about a situation, right? Let's say we have Ebenezer Scrooge, who has a huge warehouse full of bread, full of food, right? And there's a huge famine going on there in his land. He's got all of this bread, but of course, being Ebenezer Scrooge, he's charging outrageously exorbitant prices for the bread. And he knows many people are going to starve, but he's done the calculations and he's figured out that enough people will live long enough that charging this outrageous cost will ultimately make him the most profit. And so he's very happy to sit there and watch people starve to death as he maximizes his profit on his bread warehouse. Okay, so let's say we are in a situation, we are out there with a bunch of other starving people, and we're faced with a choice. Should we break into the warehouse and take the bread? Well, we're all kind of good moral people, had good upbringings, so we've all been taught, thou shalt not steal, right? And if you remember, very first principle of natural law is we should pursue the good and avoid evil, regardless of the consequences, right? So on one hand, we might say, well, look, we're going to starve to death, but we're really committed to natural law, so we shouldn't steal the bread, even if it means we might die. Well, on one level, it might seem like, okay, we arrived at our answer. Natural law is going to make us have some hard choices sometimes, and this is one of those instances. And yes, there are going to be cases where natural law is going to tell us we have to stick to a really hard decision. And in some cases, that hard decision might even cost a person their life. But is this one of those situations? And I think, again, as you all know, there's lots of debates about pretty much everything in academia, so I'm sure there would be debate by some natural law scholars on this point. But I think the majority would say that this is not one of those cases, right? That it's not, in fact, the right decision to just lay down and die and have your families die because you're not going to steal. Because we need to think a little more carefully about this moral norm of thou shalt not steal, right? What's really going on with that principle? Well, what it's really about is about the right to private property, right? That saying thou shalt not steal implies or assumes that people have a right to private property, to own their own property. Okay, all right, so how does that help us? Well, why do people have a right to private property? Why is it that we need that right? And if you look back at that list of basic goods, being rich is not one of them, right? So the reason that people have an kind of intrinsic or natural right to private property is because as it works out, as we can see in human nature, people need to have a certain amount of property that they own and that they can control in order to provide for themselves and their family and to maintain their health, to maintain their peace with others. And basically, you have to have a certain amount of food and property and clothing to live a good life, to lead a flourishing life. Now, that doesn't mean, though, and here's where we start to get into the kind of the details of our particular situation, that right to private property isn't unlimited, right? If we remember, we're not supposed to pursue any particular good in a way that's going to hurt the goods of others, right? And so, yes, there is a right to private property, which is really based on the fact that property is necessary for our own bodily good and our own relational and emotional good. Um, but that's an instrumental good. The reason we have a right to private property is because it helps us get those more important basic goods of health, of peace in our family and with other people. It's not a thing that's good in itself. Right now, with an instrumental good, if it starts to preoccupy us, we get so focused on it that it starts to undermine or damage the basic goods of ourself or other people, then it becomes a problem, and then in fact it becomes immoral. Right? So if I start to acquire private property to such a great extent that it starts to harm my own true good or harm the true good of other people, then that private property I'm accumulating is immoral, right? It's wrong for me to keep accumulating that property because it's really undermining my true good and the good of other people, right? And this brings us, of course, back to our situation with Scrooge in the warehouse. In this situation, right, Ebenezer Scrooge doesn't really have a natural right to that warehouse full of bread, right? Because the whole reason for having bread, for having private property, is to promote the real good of ourselves and others. But in this situation, it's promoting neither, right? He doesn't need all of that bread for his own health. Other people do need it for their basic good. Therefore, according to natural law, Scrooge doesn't really have a right to that warehouse full of bread. So, if we go in and take it, we are not really stealing from it, right? He really has no right to that property, right? And this, again, you can see this in lots of different situations, right? Where someone uses duplicitous means to get somebody else to sell them a bunch of property, or you coerce people into giving you property, right? We have many situations where we recognize that, well, look, even though that person has kind of a legal claim to ownership of this, they don't really have a right to it because they got it wrongly, right? And in this situation, we have a similar thing going on. So really, natural law would say, well, yes, in most cases we shouldn't steal, but in this particular case, he doesn't really have a right to that property, therefore it isn't really harming him, it isn't really stealing to take it. All right, another example, similar, right? Let's say, well, in general, right, we shouldn't lie. We shouldn't bear false witness. Handy rule in the vast majority of cases. But what happens? We have to bring in the Nazis because the Nazis have to appear several times in every ethics class. Let's say we're living in World War II Europe, and we are appalled by what's going on with the Holocaust, and so we have a number of Jewish refugees who are hiding in our attic, and the Nazis are out looking for them. Right? So the Nazis knock on the door, and they ask us, do you know where there are any Jews? Are there any Jews hiding here? What should we say? Well, again, it might seem like the easy answer is, well, we can't lie, so we have to tell them, even though the consequences are bad. But again, I think most scholars would argue that the real situation here is more complicated. Right? What do we really mean by the moral principle of thou shalt not lie, or thou shalt not bear false witness? Right? What we really mean is we shouldn't mislead people in a way that's going to hurt them, in a way that's going to undermine their true good. But there are some situations where we can tell people something that isn't true, but it is in fact not undermining their true good. It's not in fact hurting them. So one kind of obvious example would be, say you're playing a game or playing cards or poker or whatever it might be, right? If you're playing poker, for example, and you say, well, you should all fold, right? I've got a full house. You can say that even if you don't have a full house, and nobody is going to accuse you of lying, right? That you are bluffing, right? We have a different term for it because we recognize that when you're playing cards, you can't expect people to tell you the truth, right? You don't have a reasonable expectation that people are going to be honest with you when you're playing poker. A similar principle applies, I would argue, when somebody asks you, do these pants make me look fat? We all know, right, that when people ask that question, they don't really expect the truth, or they don't really at least have the reasonable expectation that you're going to tell them the truth, because almost no one is going to actually say, well, yes, now that you mention it, you look really bad in those pants, right? So there are going to be situations where we can say something that isn't true, but it's not really lying in the moral sense. It's not misleading someone in a way that's going to harm them or work against their true good, right? And so the same sort of situation applies when the Nazis knocked on the door, right? It's only an immoral lying when the people asking for information have a reasonable expectation of the truth. But in this situation, we know what they're doing, right? They are looking to kill innocent people, which they certainly have no right to do. They should know what they're doing, that they're looking to kill innocent people. So they should recognize that they do not have a reasonable expectation that people are going to help them, right? If somebody has a crazed look in their eye and knocks on your door with an axe in their hand and asks if you've seen their neighbor, if they could reflect on that situation, they should know they shouldn't really expect you to give them an honest answer because, look, you're chasing after somebody with a crazy look in your eye and an axe. In that situation, there's no reasonable expectation of the truth. Therefore, it's not, in fact, harming them to not tell them the truth. And in fact, you could argue that by not telling them where the Jews are, where the neighbor is, you're in fact helping them because you're helping them avoid committing serious moral evil. What we really should do, of course, is always seek the true good of everyone in a situation, right? So with the Nazis at the door situation, by not telling them that you have a bunch of Jews hiding in the attic, you are in fact promoting the true good of both the Jews and really of the Nazi officers as well. So there are going to be some situations which are difficult, and when we get to those difficult situations, it's important to be able to step back and look at our typical moral norms and rules, and really think about, well, what is the purpose of this rule? What is it really aiming at? It's really aiming at this true integral good of the person. Okay, how do we get to that in this specific situation? And so that's what we'll need to do when we encounter some of the more difficult cases as we go through the remainder of the course. All right, so now we've covered more or less kind of the basic decision-making process or judgment process, if you will, for natural law. Right? That what we always need to do is to really aim at the true integral good, true flourishing of ourselves and other people. And in the vast majority of cases, there are kind of widely held moral norms that are going to help us do that. But again, ethics classes are, in most cases, kind of focused on, well, what about these difficult decisions we need to make? And a lot of the things we're going to focus on in this class and in lots of other classes like it is looking at what everyone agrees are really kind of complex situations and trying to figure out, well, what's the right thing to do here? And one of the situations that often comes up in lots of different fields and lots of different contexts in life is we can be faced with a choice where should I do this or not? And this particular action isn't going to have only one effect, only one consequence. There's in fact going to be two or more effects that follow from this choice. And then a lot of these difficult choices, we're faced with a situation where if we do something, it's going to produce a good desired effect, but it's also going to produce a bad effect that we know we ought to avoid. So what do we do in these situations where it's not as simple as I either save the lives of the Jews in the attic or I don't, or we either avoid starving or we don't, where there's going to be a good effect, but there's also going to be a bad effect that's going to follow from doing this as well. What do we do in these sorts of situations? And this is where we get to the principle of double effect, which is an important part of natural law. Now, the first thing to say about the principle of double effect is that this is not utilitarianism, right? This is not saying, okay, well, when we're faced with a choice and there's going to be good and bad outcomes, what we really need to do is figure out, is the good going to be outweigh the bad, and if so, okay, we can do it, right? So a lot of people, when they hear about this principle of double effect, that's kind of what they think is going on, but that is not, in fact, what's going on, right? This is a different ethical process, a different set of principles than utilitarianism, right? So what is the principle of double effect? Well, the principle of double effect is really kind of a set of four criteria that we can look at and see if our choice in the situation meets these criteria or not, right? And the important thing to notice is that you need to meet all four of them in order for the act to be moral. Okay, well, how does this work? Well, we have to work our way down through these criteria. So first off, we're faced with this kind of difficult choice that has a good and bad effect. The first thing to ask ourselves is the act itself immoral, right? So if the action itself is immoral, then it doesn't matter if there's a good effect that's going to come out of it, or even if the good effect is bigger than the bad effect. We can't do it, right? So if you were in a situation where, we need to kill an innocent person, and in order to do so, we're going to stop a war, right? And countless lives will be saved. But in order to do that, what we need to do is intentionally kill this one innocent person, and through some weird series of consequences, we can foresee that this is going to stop the war. Well, look, utilitarianism might tell you in that situation, yes, you can do that, because the good of avoiding the war outweighs the bad of this one person being killed. Natural law and principle of double effect is going to tell you that that's not the case, right? That intentionally killing an innocent person is an act that is always immoral, right? It doesn't matter what the consequences are, that act is always immoral. It's a moral norm that's called a moral absolute, right? That it can never be moral to intentionally kill an innocent person. So in this case, our situation fails the first criterion of the principle of double effect, therefore we can't do it. All right, so let's say for the sake of argument, our situation is a little different, and the act itself isn't immoral, it's amoral or moral, but it's not an intentionally wrong action. All right, what's the next thing we need to consider? Well, the next thing we need to consider is the intention for the good, right? Well, what does this mean? Well, one example that often gets brought up is, according to Catholic ethics and according to most natural law theorists, intentional sterilization of a person is immoral, right? So it is immoral to intentionally sterilize yourself so that you can't reproduce. Again, thinking about it, because reproduction is part of our God-given nature, and is a basically good thing, and so to intentionally harm that good is immoral. But let's say there's a situation where there's some sort of medical problem going on, and so doctors advise a woman to get a hysterectomy, right? And so in a hysterectomy, the uterus is removed, and so obviously in that situation, there's no possibility of reproduction anymore. The woman's going to be rendered sterile. Now, we're in this situation, let's say, and the woman, she has this medical problem, but let's say that she's kind of really a reluctant Catholic, and what she really wants is to avoid having any more kids. What she really wants is to be sterilized. And so in this situation, she's kind of happy. Well, I'm kind of glad that this medical problem came up so that now I can be sterilized and avoid having any more kids, right? So in this situation, there's a good outcome, right? We're going to deal with this medical problem, and a morally bad outcome, the sterilization. Um, but the act itself is neither moral or immoral, right? Surgically removing a diseased organ is not an immoral thing. But in this situation, this woman is actually intending the bad outcome, right? What she actually wants, what she actually intends, is the sterilization. And in that case, this would be an immoral act for her, right? You can't desire the morally bad outcome and just use the good effect, if you will, as an excuse for doing the bad thing that you want to do. So in that situation, her act would be immoral, right? And again, this is maybe kind of technical, but we probably all understand this idea, right? That you can't use an unintended good consequence to justify some bad thing you want to do, right? Obviously, people do this all the time, but if we really reflect on it, we would say, well, that was still a wrong choice for them to make because what they really wanted was the bad thing. Okay, well, let's assume that's not the situation, right? That we have a case where the act isn't immoral, where we're not intending the bad outcome. But we also then need to ask, is the bad effect the means for attaining the good, right? Do we get the good thing through the bad effect? And if that's the case, then again, we can't do it because basically we're intentionally doing the bad thing, right? If you go back to the very first principle, you can never pursue evil. You can never intentionally do wrong. So if it's a situation where we're getting the good effect through the bad one, it would be immoral to do that, right? So an example of this would be kind of end-of-life care situation. One of the scenarios that's often brought up is, well, what if somebody's in a lot of pain and is on a lot of painkillers, but it's not really being effective at this point? Well, what should we do? Well, you can have a situation where you could give them a patient who's in a lot of pain more painkiller, even if there were, say, a risk of that leading to an earlier death, in order to avoid the pain. That would be kind of a classic example of a situation where you could use the principal double effect to say, look, I need to give this patient more painkiller. There's a chance that this is going to increase the risk of dying, but it's going to reduce their pain, right? So increased risk of dying is a bad effect, reduced pain is a good effect, and you can work through this situation and say, yes, it could be moral to do this because we're aiming for this good. The increased risk of death is an unintended consequence. We could work through all these criteria and still come up with, yes, it's okay to do this. Now, you could have a slightly different version of that scenario where we could say, look, this patient is in a lot of pain. The painkiller we're giving right now isn't really working. The only way to really deal with this pain effectively is going to be give them this much larger dose. And in fact, we know that this much larger dose is in fact going to lead the patient to stop breathing and to die, right? So now in this situation, we're not wanting the death of the patient, right? What we want is the reduction in pain. And we're honestly saying that in this situation. So we're not violating that second criteria. We don't want the death of the patient. We want the pain reduction. But in this situation where the pain reduction is going to ultimately come through the death, come through the bad effect, we're going to be violating this third criteria, right? You can't get the good of the reduction of pain through the bad effect of the patient dying, right? Because really what you're doing in that situation then is you are intentionally killing the patient to reduce the pain, and we can never intentionally kill an innocent person. So that would be an example of violating that third criterion of principal double effect. All right, now the last effect is, the last criterion is the bad effect cannot exceed the good. Right, so to kind of just go back to some of the situations we've already used, Um, you know, let's say I break my arm. And it hurts a lot, but it's a broken arm. It's not kind of end stage cancer or something like that. So it would not be moral in that situation, probably, to give me painkiller that would give me a significant risk of death, right? Because look, a broken arm really hurts. Believe me, I know, or can. Um, but reducing the pain of a broken arm is not a sufficient enough good to balance the bad of a significant risk of death. Right now, if somebody is at the very end of life and battling terminal cancer, that situation gets changes, right? In that case, the good is much greater, and the bad effect of a slightly premature and slight increased risk of death is relatively minor, and so the situation is different. The same thing could go back to our example of the hysterectomy, right? So, again, without getting into lots of details, which frankly are probably beyond me, there could be, let's say, a relatively minor medical complaint where it causes some discomfort or what have you, but it's not kind of crippling and not serious kind of constant pain. Ought we to carry out a procedure that's going to sterilize someone for kind of a relatively minor medical condition? Even if we met all these other criteria and they were honestly just wanting to deal with a medical problem, if it's a pretty minor thing, then you still ought not to do it if it's going to have this significant bad effect of sterilizing a person, right? However, if the bad effect or if the good effect were much greater, right? If it wasn't a minor medical complaint, if this was kind of a serious, debilitating medical condition that was kind of really disrupting the quality of this person's life, then it would be moral, right? Because yes, sterilization from a natural law perspective is bad, but there's a really big good of addressing this debilitating medical problem. Now again, if you just look at this very kind of quick and not carefully, it could look like what's going on here is utilitarianism. But what you need to recall is that this is the fourth step in the process. We only look at balancing the good and bad effects after we get through the other three steps of making sure we're not intentionally doing something wrong and not intending the bad effect and not getting the bad effect or not getting the good effect through the bad effect. Right? So this balancing of good and bad, of pleasure and pain, if you will, only comes at the very end of a much longer process. All right, so that there is a quick run through the principle of double effect. Certainly, if you have questions about that, let me know. And hopefully, we can again clarify this and some of the other things as we work through concrete examples through the rest of the course. All right, so we've looked at how we make moral decisions using natural law, using moral norms, kind of reasoning through the moral norms in complex cases. And now we've also looked at how we make those decisions when it's not just a straight good or bad outcome, but we have a mixed outcome with a good and bad effect. How do we do that? Then the last thing that I want to cover to kind of wrap up this practical natural law module is to look at this thing called the principle of legitimate cooperation, right? And this is something that we use to apply natural law to situations where we are just part of a much larger action, part of a much larger system, right? And where our role in it isn't direct, right? We're part of a larger system that's doing something, and doing something in this case that's immoral, right? So how do we judge our involvement in different systems, in different organizations where an immoral act is happening? That's what we have the principle of legitimate cooperation for. And of course, this is going to be important in lots of different situations when we're thinking about our role as citizens or our role as employees or parts of different groups that might be doing different immoral things. I'm sure it would be a shock if the government did something immoral. But for our cases in this class, it's also going to be particularly important in terms of our role as, say, consumers, right? Should we participate in a particular agricultural or commercial system that's doing something wrong as consumers? What's our level of responsibility in that situation? And that's what the principle of legitimate cooperation is for. And again, like the principle of double effect, this is not kind of an equation that we can just plug things into and pop out an answer. Really what it is a set of guidelines, a set of criteria that we can work through to help us figure out the right choice, or figure out what our level of involvement is, so that we can know if we need to make a change or not. Okay, so the principle of legitimate cooperation, how does this work? Well, really there's basically what it does is divide up our degree of cooperation with an immoral act into 4 different possible levels of cooperation. So one example that is used in one of the textbooks I've used before is the example of abortion. Right? From a natural law perspective, abortion is immoral. Right? It's the intentional killing of an innocent human person. Now, again, we can get into that debate some other time, or on the discussion board if you'd like. But we'll just go for the moment and say, look, abortion is an immoral act according to natural law. Now, what about different degrees of cooperation with this? Well, formal cooperation is a way of saying that you agree with the action that's being performed. So let's say you work at a hospital where abortions are being performed, and you see this as a good thing and an important service to the community, and you have no problem whatsoever with abortions being performed, and you're happy to contribute to that work of the hospital. So that would be an example of formal cooperation, right, where you formally agree with this action being performed. And in that case, according to the principle of legitimate cooperation, you are morally responsible, right, that you can be held morally responsible for this immoral act because you are formally cooperating with it. All right. But let's imagine a situation where you work at a hospital that's performing abortions, but you are personally opposed to abortions, right? You wish the hospital didn't do them, you disagree with them, you think it's immoral, but you still work at the hospital, right? Well, how do we analyze your degree of moral responsibility in those situations? Well, again, it's going to depend on how immediately you are involved with the performance of abortions at the hospital, right? And this is where we get to the other 3 levels. So all of these are called material cooperation, right? That's when you don't agree in principle with what's going on, but you are some way involved in carrying out the action materially. Right? So immediate material cooperation would be you are immediately materially involved. So that would be, for example, say you are a nurse assisting in the procedure that's carrying out the abortion, right? You're handing instruments to the doctor or what have you. That's an immediate material cooperation, right? And the principle of legitimate cooperation says immediate material cooperation is immoral, right? So another way to put this is you have a moral obligation to stop being immediately materially involved, right? So you are morally obligated to stop doing that. And if you don't, then you are morally responsible for your part in those acts. Okay, but let's say you're not actually kind of handing instruments. You're not that immediately involved in what's going on in performing these abortions. What might be kind of another level? Well, the next level down, if you will, is called proximate material cooperation. Proximate material cooperation, an example might be, let's say you set up the procedure room, right, that you are involved in getting the room ready for procedures, or let's say you work in accounting and you in particular process the insurance claims for abortion procedures. That would be perhaps an example of proximate material cooperation, right? You're not right there involved in it, but you also have a significant connection to the actual action that's going on. And again, what natural law would say in this situation, what the principle of original cooperation would say, is that in that situation, you still have a moral obligation to stop that level of involvement, right? That you have a moral obligation to avoid proximate material cooperation with an immoral act. All right, let's take it down to the next step then. This would obviously be remote material cooperation, right? And the important thing to note here is remote material cooperation is the one level of cooperation that is, in some cases, morally permissible, right? So let's say, for example, that you have been unemployed for a long time, you've got a family that depends on you, you've been really looking for a job everywhere, and the only job you can find is at this hospital. You think abortion is wrong, but you know that this hospital performs abortion. But this is the only place you can find a job, let's say as a mechanic in the engineering department, right? You're repairing air conditioners and such around the hospital. Well, in that situation, that would basically fit what is meant by remote material cooperation, right? You're not really involved in abortion procedures. You're not setting the room up or doing anything like that. You just work at the same hospital in some disconnected field. That would be remote material cooperation. Now, in that case, that person would not be acting immorally, would not have a moral obligation to stop going to work. Now, the important thing to note, though, is right, remote material cooperation means you aren't morally responsible for what's going on. However, if you are remotely materially cooperating, I know it's a mouthful, what natural law would say is that you should still work to eliminate even that level of cooperation. So, for example, let's say you get this job and you're able to provide for your family, but you know that this hospital you're working for is doing these immoral procedures. What you ought to do is to keep an eye out and see if you can find a job with a different company, with a different hospital, say, that doesn't carry out these procedures, right? That it's morally preferable to avoid even remote material cooperation. However, if you really can't find another job that will provide for your family, then you can take that job, right? So, for example, to get back maybe to a more pertinent issue for our course, let's say the only way you can afford to feed your family is to buy, the mass-produced food that you know is harming the environment or doesn't treat animals properly or what have you. Again, this is something we'll work out as we go through the class, but there's a decent possibility that in some situation like that, you would only be remotely materially cooperating with what's going on. The lesson from all of this isn't that, you're only remotely involved, you can go on with your life. It would say, well, look, because you're in this particular situation, yes, you can feed your family with the food you can afford to buy, but you should also still be looking for ways to avoid that. Looking for ways to get the company to change its policies so that it's not doing immoral things to give you your food, or looking for different food that you could buy where you could provide for your family without even being remotely involved in this immoral thing that's going on. All right, so that is an intro to the principle of legitimate cooperation. And again, I know this is a lot of material to go through, so we will get practice with these things as we go through specific situations and cases in the course. And also, please, I'm going to be posting on Blackboard a reading to go through, which is kind of a question and answer about natural law. It's an imaginary conversation between a natural law person and a skeptic. That's going to bring up a lot of the questions that you might have about natural law. So please make sure you read that. Then we can discuss these things more on Blackboard. And as always, if you have a question kind of beyond the question that I ask on Blackboard, feel free to bring it up, especially in that Ask the Professor forum, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.